Global division of labor, rise and fall. Abstract. This article examines the structural collapse of post-industrial society through the interrelated processes of the degradation of the division of labor, the corruption of the middle class, and the emergence of direct coercive power. It argues that the apparent autonomy of service-based economies conceals a dependence on the imperial hierarchy of global production and extraction. Drawing on world systems theory, Wallerstein, Marxian political economy, and contemporary sociology, Gramsci, Bourdieu, Foucault, the study interprets post-industrial modernity as a phase of parasitic globalization in which the service sector sustains itself only through externalized industrial labor and financial rent. As global hierarchies erode and automation diminishes the administrative functions of the middle class, mediation between state, capital, and society collapses. The middle class, once the stabilizing force of industrial modernity, is displaced by a dual structure, a technocratic capitalist elite exercising formal control and a criminal class managing the informal economy. In this bifurcated sovereignty, legality and illegality coexist as complementary mechanisms of governance. The final section argues that the dissolution of the division of labor and the moral disintegration of the middle class necessitate the rise of direct coercive governance, algorithmic, militarized, and extralegal as the new organizing principle of political economy. The transition from industrial mediation to criminal sovereignty thus signifies not a breakdown of order but its reconstitution through the fusion of technology, violence, and informal power. Chapter 1. The modern post-industrial society presents itself as the form of historical development, characterized by the predominance of services, information, and culture over production, materiality, and labor. Yet its very structure reveals that this claim to autonomy is deceptive. The apparent superiority of service-based economies depends not on self-sufficiency but on the maintenance of a global hierarchy of production and extraction. What appears as post-industrial is, in reality, the surface manifestation of a deeper economic and political dependence, sustained by the subordination of industrial and resource economies elsewhere. The post-industrial condition presupposes an imperial structure in which the material foundation of modern life is outsourced and externalized. Its complexity is not autarkic but hierarchical, not emancipated from matter but redistributed across a global division of labor, Wallerstein. The logic of this hierarchy is visible in the stratified structure of the world system, where the core nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and other advanced service economies dominate the global periphery through financial, technological, and cultural control. The semi-periphery, represented by states such as China, Turkey, or Brazil, operates as the transitional zone where industrial production and service sophistication intersect but remain constrained by dependence on the core. The periphery itself, comprising large parts of Africa, Central Asia, and Latin America, functions as the extractive base of resources and cheap labor. The wealth of post-industrial societies thus depends on externalized industrial labor, mediated through mechanisms of finance, intellectual property, and information control. The apparent dematerialization of production is, therefore, the ideological mask of a renewed imperial extraction that reproduces the old core periphery asymmetry in digital and financial form. This dependence means that no service-based economy can sustain itself independently of industrial production. The infrastructure that supports finance, culture, and communication remains inseparable from the material base of energy, logistics, and hardware. Cloud computing, digital media, and financial transactions depend upon the continuous flow of rare earth minerals, manufactured components, and energy-intensive data centers. What is called the clean economy rests upon a global understructure of dirty labor, environmental degradation, and coercive extraction. The service economy is thus parasitic upon the global circulation of industrial and resource value, whose center of gravity it does not control but must politically and militarily secure. The claim of post-industrial superiority is, therefore, inseparable from the persistence of imperial hierarchy. When that hierarchy erodes, the supposed autonomy of the service economy reveals its hollowness and fragility. Historical experience confirms this structural dependence. The British Empire in the 19th century achieved its financial supremacy only by transferring the burden of production to its colonies, transforming its domestic economy from manufacturing to administration and finance while relying on Indian textiles, Chinese tea, and African raw materials. The United States repeated this pattern in the late 20th century, deindustrializing its domestic base while maintaining control over global finance, media, and military power. The European Union, and particularly the United Kingdom after deindustrialization, occupy a similar position today. They remain service-oriented economies that survive by subordinating industrial and labor-intensive zones in Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Asia. The material dependence of service economies is thus both structural and historical. To lose control over their subordinate peripheries is to lose the foundation of their own apparent complexity. It is in this context that China emerges as a systemic threat to the established order. Its combination of industrial capacity, technological innovation, and infrastructural expansion through projects such as the Belt and Road Initiative challenges the monopoly of service-based hegemony. Whereas Western economies sustain themselves through financial rents and informational control, China aims to reintegrate production, logistics, and technology within a single sovereign framework. This model subverts the existing hierarchy by inverting the flow of dependency. Instead of providing low-cost labor for Western capital, it seeks to make others dependent on Chinese infrastructure, manufacturing, and digital systems. The fear that animates Western political discourse is not merely geopolitical competition but the potential loss of the rentier position that underlies the service-based illusion of post-industrial prosperity. Russia, by contrast, illustrates the inverse condition, a state that has exited industrial modernity without achieving post-industrial hegemony. Lacking a diversified industrial base and a complex service economy, Russia occupies an intermediate, semi-peripheral position without a periphery of its own to exploit. It is post-industrial in structure but not post-industrial in power, and thus vulnerable to both economic stagnation and geopolitical isolation. The Russian case reveals that post-industrialization without imperial access results not in sophistication but in dependency and decline. The global hierarchy, once internalized, determines whether deindustrialization signifies transcendence or collapse. Within this world system, the middle class historically served as the social and ideological mediator of modernity. In industrial societies, it functioned as the backbone of production and administration, linking capital and labor within a shared national project. It embodied the ideals of progress, rational organization, and technical competence. In the Fordist economies of the 20th century, it represented stability, the promise of social mobility through education and work, secured by unions and state institutions. But in the post-industrial service economy, the middle class has been redefined. It no longer mediates between productive capital and labor but between global capital and domestic consumption. Its material foundation has shifted from factories to offices, from production to coordination, from national development to global management. The post-industrial middle class is not a builder of the nation but an agent of globalization. Its function is now administrative and ideological, to sustain the legitimacy of a global order that depends on invisible industrial labor elsewhere. Working in finance, education, media, and technology, it narrates and justifies the global hierarchy in the language of cosmopolitanism, sustainability, and inclusion. It embodies the moral ideology of globalization while materially depending on its asymmetries. It is the class that most sincerely believes in the universality of liberal values precisely because its privileges are anchored in the global division of labor. Its cosmopolitanism, as Bourdieu would suggest, represents a form of symbolic capital, a distinction that conceals material dependence beneath the appearance of cultural refinement. Yet this position is precarious. As China reclaims technological sovereignty, as Russia and other states decouple from Western markets, and as automation and artificial intelligence erode managerial and bureaucratic roles, the post-industrial middle class finds itself functionally redundant. The very processes it once administered, globalization, production outsourcing, and financial intermediation, are now automated or strategically reversed. Its credentials are devalued, its symbolic capital eroded, and its economic function diminished. What remains is ideological performance without material anchoring, the production of discourse, image, and effect in place of administration or manufacture. The result is a class that oscillates between elitist self-identification and proletarian precarity, what Marx called the petty bourgeoisie, suspended between two worlds and belonging fully to neither. This structural fragility precipitates a larger social transformation. As the mediating role of the middle class collapses, the service economy bifurcates into two opposing poles. At one extreme stands the technocratic elite, a small stratum of high-value professionals engaged in financial engineering, artificial intelligence, security, and consulting. Their work serves transnational capital and the state apparatus directly. At the other extreme lies the mass of low-status service labor, gig workers, delivery drivers, caregivers, entertainers, and informal employees managed by algorithms and deprived of long-term stability. Between these poles, the traditional middle stratum disintegrates. The service economy, once celebrated for its inclusivity and flexibility, hardens into a dual structure of privilege and precarity. The middle class, once the stabilizing center of modern society, becomes the disappearing mediator of a collapsing order. With the erosion of mediation comes the restructuring of the entire social pyramid. The technocratic capitalist elite fuses with state and security institutions, forming a post-bourgeois oligarchy based on control of information and infrastructure rather than ownership of factories or land. Below it, the security apparatus encompassing the military, police, and private enforcement agencies assumes a central political role, compensating for the decline of ideological consensus through coercive management. The masses, deprived of industrial employment and middle-class stability, oscillate between dependency and rebellion, sustained by welfare, informal economies, and spectacle. At the margins, a residual intelligentsia survives as a kind of ideological underclass, freelance writers, influencers, adjuncts, and NGO workers who simulate cultural authority while lacking material power. The result is a society polarized between a technocratic elite and a managed mass, with mediation replaced by surveillance and control. Gramsci, Foucault. This transformation recalls earlier moments of civilizational decline. In the late Roman Empire, the disintegration of municipal middle classes led to the rise of a militarized bureaucracy and the subordination of free citizens to a centralized state. In Weimar Germany, the collapse of the bourgeois middle precipitated the polarization of society into technocratic elites, paramilitary organizations, and radicalized masses. In post-Soviet Russia, the destruction of the Soviet middle class produced the oligarchic order of the 1990s, where criminal entrepreneurs and security elites replaced bureaucratic mediation. Each case reveals a pattern: when the middle class loses its mediating function, governance shifts from persuasion to force, from legality to exception, from consensus to control. The disappearance of the middle class does not leave a vacuum, rather, it invites substitution. The new mediating force that arises in its absence is not bureaucratic but criminal. Organized crime, as the self-organizing apex of the informal economy, assumes the functions once performed by the bourgeoisie. It mediates between power and population, ensures circulation of goods and money, and enforces a semblance of order where formal institutions have failed. This substitution is not metaphorical but structural. As the legitimacy of law erodes, trust migrates from institutions to personal networks of loyalty, fear, and reputation. The criminal class becomes the guarantor of social coordination precisely because the official structures of governance have lost credibility. In the post-middle class era, sovereignty is reconstituted on an informal, extralegal basis, a form of criminal sovereignty that governs through coercion and charisma rather than legality. Gambetta, Schmidt. Organized crime functions as a parallel state, not as an antagonist of the state but as its shadow and complement. It occupies the spaces where institutional trust collapses and law enforcement becomes selective or predatory. In these zones, it provides arbitration, security, and redistribution. The mafia, cartel, or gang thus becomes a parapolitical structure that mirrors the state's functions without its formal legitimacy. It extracts taxes in the form of protection money, enforces contracts through violence, and maintains social order through fear. In doing so, it replicates the logic of sovereignty as decision in the state of exception. Schmidt. The gangster, like the sovereign, decides when the law applies and when it is suspended. He embodies the will to order in a world where legality has lost its authority. The social pyramid of the post-industrial collapse can therefore be rewritten. At the top stands the technocratic elite, the fusion of state and capital that governs the formal sphere. Beneath it operates the security apparatus, which enforces control through surveillance and coercion. Below this layer emerges the criminal class, which governs the informal sphere by mediating between the disenfranchised masses and the corrupt elite. At the bottom lies the fragmented population, simultaneously dependent, serviled, and excluded. The criminal class thus becomes the de facto substitute for the bourgeois middle. It provides access, protection, and mobility where legality no longer does. Violence replaces merit as the mechanism of advancement, and informal capital replaces education as the key to power. The result is a bifurcated sovereignty, formal at the top, criminal at the base, that holds society together through complementary forms of coercion. The historical precedents of this substitution are numerous. In southern Italy, the Camorra and 'Ndrangheta filled the vacuum left by the absent state, establishing systems of governance that combined coercion with community integration. In Mexico, drug cartels exercise territorial sovereignty, controlling infrastructure and justice in entire regions. In Russia during the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet administrative class gave rise to the thieves-in-law, who mediated between the population and the emerging oligarchic elite. In Brazil's favelas, gangs perform social and political functions more effectively than the state, maintaining order and providing welfare. Even in the urban centers of the United States, gang networks operate as informal regulators of life where institutional policing functions as occupation rather than protection. In each case, organized crime steps into the space vacated by the state and its middle-class mediators, reconstructing sovereignty on an informal foundation. This process transforms not only governance but also the economy. As the formal service sector decays, it does not simply disappear, it mutates. The market reorganizes itself according to the logic of informality and survival. Sectors capable of being criminalized, those that can operate in cash, avoid regulation, or integrate with illicit networks, persist or even flourish. Security, logistics, construction, entertainment, and informal finance become the core of this new economy. Their proximity to violence and corruption becomes a competitive advantage rather than a liability. Conversely, sectors that depend on legality, stability, and public trust, education, healthcare, law, and culture disintegrate. The economy polarizes between criminal adaptability and moral obsolescence. In this criminalized environment, economic success no longer depends on efficiency or innovation but on the capacity for informal protection and extra-legal negotiation. The distinction between legitimate and illegitimate enterprise erodes. Legal firms engage in laundering and bribery, criminal organizations invest in legal ventures. The two spheres become inseparable. The market evolves into a hybrid ecosystem of legality and illegality, where survival depends on flexibility, violence tolerance, and connections to power. The professional skills of the former middle-class administration, communication, mediation are redeployed in the service of informal capital. Lawyers become fixers, programmers become hackers, and managers become brokers of corruption. The economy does not vanish, it darkens. The result is a profound inversion of modern values. In the classical industrial order, success was tied to legality, productivity, and merit. In the criminalized post-industrial order, survival is tied to adaptability, protection, and force. The moral economy of modernity gives way to a pragmatic economy of survival. The decline of the middle class thus signifies not only the end of a social group but the collapse of an entire mode of mediation between legality and necessity, between state and population, between capital and labor. The world that succeeds it is not anarchic but governed by a dual sovereignty of technocratic control and criminal management. Order persists, but its legitimacy is gone. This transformation marks the ultimate consequence of the post-industrial condition. What began as the outsourcing of production and the abstraction of value culminates in the erosion of legality itself. A society that externalizes its material base ultimately externalizes its moral and institutional base as well. The division of labor, once the foundation of modern order, becomes a division of sovereignty, formal for the elite, criminal for the rest. When mediation collapses, governance becomes direct, naked, and dual, administered above by algorithms and below by gangs. Between them, the remains of the middle class drift without function, nostalgia for legality replaced by the realism of survival. In this sense, the trajectory from division of labor to criminal sovereignty is not an accident but a structural culmination. The same forces that produced post-industrial prosperity, outsourcing, automation, financialization, also dissolve the social and moral conditions that sustained it. Once the global hierarchy falters and the middle class loses its function, the mechanisms of mediation are reconstructed on informal foundations. The service economy does not end but mutates into an ecosystem of criminal services, where the skills of bureaucracy, negotiation, and coordination are redeployed under new rules. The post-industrial society, stripped of its illusions, reveals its true form, a global network of formal and informal sovereignties sustained not by legality but by control, fear, and necessity. Chapter 2. The concept of post-industrial society, once heralded as the highest stage of economic and civilizational evolution, is increasingly revealed to be a fragile and historically contingent formation. What appeared as the triumph of information, services, and cultural capital over material production now shows itself as a derivative system, dependent on externalized industrial labor, global asymmetries, and geopolitical dominance. The service-based economy was never a self-sufficient order, but rather an imperial superstructure erected upon the industrial base of other societies. The apparent autonomy of symbolic, financial, and technological sectors masked an underlying dependence on material processes relocated to subordinated zones of the world economy. As the global order fragments and the material foundation of this hierarchy erodes, the service civilization begins to confront its own historical limits. The middle class that once embodied its ideals of flexibility, merit, and rational mediation dissolves, and the institutions that relied upon its integrative function weaken. Out of this dissolution emerges a new structure of power, one that reconfigures sovereignty around informal and extra-legal forms of control. What follows is a theoretical and historical reconstruction of this trajectory from the industrial division of labor to the post-industrial service economy, and from its decline to the rise of what may be called criminal sovereignty. The historical emergence of industrial society represented a profound transformation in the structure of labor, class, and governance. Mechanized production required a vast new layer of administrators, engineers, and skilled workers who mediated between capital and labor, integrating the technical and political systems of industrial modernity. The middle class of this era was not merely a social buffer, it was the institutional embodiment of rationalization, discipline, and bureaucratic order. It linked productive labor to the national state, sustaining the ideal of progress through material productivity and technical expertise. The industrial middle class thus served as the stabilizing center of the social pyramid, ensuring both economic functionality and ideological coherence. Its material anchoring in production endowed it with a sense of autonomy and dignity, while its bureaucratic role aligned it with the project of nation building and modernization. Industrial modernity, in this sense, was not only a mode of production but also a moral and political ontology grounded in the visible, tangible work of transformation. The shift toward a post-industrial order, however, displaced this entire structure. As advanced economies outsourced manufacturing to cheaper labor zones, they redefined value creation around services, finance, and information. What seemed to be an evolution beyond material production was in fact the globalization of the industrial base. The deindustrialized core extracted surplus through control of finance, intellectual property, branding, and global logistics rather than through direct production. The material foundation of prosperity was no longer domestic but externalized across a vast neo-colonial network of industrial and resource economies. Post-industrial society could thus maintain its apparent complexity and wealth only by occupying a structurally dominant position within the world system, Wallerstein. The service economy's autonomy was therefore an illusion, its survival depended on the imperial subordination of others. This global hierarchy produced a new configuration of class relations. The middle class of the service economy was no longer the industrial engineer or the bureaucrat of the modern state, but the consultant, manager, creative professional, or financial specialist operating within a transnational field. Its function was to mediate not between capital and labor within a national framework, but between the global elite and the local populations through cultural production, administration, and ideological management. It became an agent of globalization itself, culturally cosmopolitan, politically liberal, and economically dependent on the stability of the world market structure that underpinned its privileges. Its symbolic capital, as Bourdieu might suggest, derived from education, distinction, and mobility, yet its economic security increasingly rested on rents extracted from global asymmetry rather than domestic production. The middle class thus became both a beneficiary and an instrument of the post-industrial empire, sustaining its ideological narrative of openness, meritocracy, and human rights while remaining parasitic on the labor of the periphery. However, this configuration contained within it the seeds of decay. The post-industrial middle class was structurally derivative. Its existence presupposed the continued subordination of the global periphery and the maintenance of the hegemonic financial order. As this order began to erode under the pressures of geopolitical competition, technological disruption, and ecological crisis, the material foundation of the service society weakened. Automation and artificial intelligence undermined managerial and clerical labor. Supply chain disruptions revealed the fragility of externalized production, and political decoupling with rising powers such as China and Russia threatened the imperial rents that sustained consumer affluence. In short, the very processes that defined post-industrial success, outsourcing, financialization, and digitalization, also rendered it vulnerable to systemic instability. The middle class, once a stabilizing force, became precarious, ideologically fragmented, and economically redundant. Its traditional roles in mediation, administration, and legitimacy could no longer be fulfilled within a shrinking material base. The crisis of the middle class is therefore not a sociological anomaly but a structural transformation of capitalism itself. When the mediating layer collapses, the social order polarizes. The service economy bifurcates into two poles, a high elite stratum of technocratic and financial professionals directly serving transnational capital and state security, and a vast sector of low-status, disposable services organized around platform labor, logistics, and emotional or bodily work. Between these poles, the middle stratum dissolves. The result is not the disappearance of the service economy but its mutation into a dual system, one enclave of concentrated knowledge and power, and another of precarious servitude. The integrative function once performed by the middle class gives way to direct control and surveillance. The mechanisms of consensus, education, and civic participation that characterized industrial and early post-industrial modernity are replaced by algorithmic governance, bureaucratic opacity, and coercive enforcement. The division of labor no longer reproduces social harmony but institutionalizes hierarchy. Historically, such transitions have tended to produce new forms of sovereignty. In the absence of a mediating class, governance becomes either militarized or criminalized. The late Roman Empire, the Weimar Republic, and the post-Soviet collapse each illustrate how the erosion of the middle stratum leads to the replacement of bureaucratic mediation with direct coercion and informal power. In these contexts, the state loses its integrative tissue, and alternative structures emerge to perform the functions of protection, arbitration, and resource distribution. When legality ceases to guarantee order, violence and reputation take its place. The vacuum left by the disintegrating middle class becomes filled not by civic institutions but by organized crime, which evolves into a parallel form of sovereignty. The rise of criminal sovereignty marks the culmination of the post-industrial crisis. It signifies not the total breakdown of order, but the reconfiguration of order around informal and extra-legal mechanisms. Organized crime assumes the roles once reserved for civil bureaucracy, resolving disputes, enforcing contracts, allocating resources, and providing security in spaces where the state has withdrawn or lost legitimacy. In such contexts, the economy continues to function, but through the logic of protection, extortion, and personal loyalty rather than law and transparency. The division of labor persists, yet its organizing principle shifts from institutional specialization to coercive adaptability. The criminal network, in this sense, becomes the invisible infrastructure of social continuity in an era of institutional disintegration. This transformation can be understood through the lens of what scholars like Diego Gambetta and Federico Varese describe as shadow states, where organized crime fills the vacuum left by the absence or weakness of legitimate authority. The mafia is not merely parasitic on the state but structurally analogous to it, performing similar functions in a more flexible, localized, and often more efficient manner. As Giorgio Agamben and Michel Foucault might suggest, such systems embody biopolitics without mediation, the direct governance of life through informal power, surveillance, and fear. Carl Schmitt's notion of sovereignty, the power to decide on the exception, finds its contemporary expression in the gang leader, warlord, or cartel boss who commands loyalty through pragmatic control rather than legal right. The monopoly of legitimate violence becomes diffuse, and legitimacy itself is replaced by functionality. Sovereignty survives, but its foundation shifts from law to the management of insecurity. The criminal class thus assumes the role once performed by the bourgeoisie. It mediates between the ruling elite and the population, organizes flows of value and power, and maintains a minimal order through coercion and patronage. This substitution has profound implications for the structure of society. At the top, a technocratic elite fused with financial capital and state apparatuses manages global flows of data, money, and coercive technology. Beneath it, the security apparatus, both formal and private, enforces control. At the intermediary level, criminal networks operate as informal brokers, integrating the lower classes into systems of exchange and obedience. At the bottom lie the fragmented masses, economically disposable, politically disoriented, and dependent on either welfare mechanisms or criminal economies for survival. The ideological intelligentsia, once the voice of critical reflection, devolves into a performative underclass that reproduces symbolic noise without institutional power. This is the architecture of post-industrial collapse, a fusion of technocracy and criminality, with mediation replaced by domination. Geopolitically, the rise of criminal sovereignty exposes new vulnerabilities. In societies where the native middle class has been hollowed out, organized crime becomes an instrument of both internal governance and foreign manipulation. Criminal networks can serve as conduits for hybrid warfare, economic infiltration, and political subversion. The post-Soviet space provides ample illustration. In the 1990s, the disintegration of the Soviet bureaucratic middle class gave rise to oligarchic criminal complexes that effectively replaced state institutions. Similar processes can be observed in Latin America, where cartels operate as territorial sovereigns, and in parts of Africa and the Balkans, where criminal infrastructures are integrated into formal politics. In such environments, sovereignty becomes plural and contested. Power is distributed among formal states, private corporations, security agencies, and criminal syndicates. The result is a hybrid political economy in which legality is negotiable and governance is transactional. The economic logic of this transformation is equally significant. In a collapsing service economy, sectors that depend on legality, regulation, and middle-class consumption such as education, healthcare, and cultural institutions enter terminal decline. They cannot sustain themselves without the fiscal and social infrastructure of the formal state. By contrast, sectors that are compatible with informal or criminal operations such as private security, real estate, logistics, entertainment, and underground finance adapt and even thrive. They can operate on cash flows, circumvent regulations, and integrate with illicit networks. The economy does not disappear, it mutates into a criminal ecosystem governed by the laws of adaptability, violence tolerance, and informal protection. In such conditions, professional skills migrate from legal to illegal domains, lawyers become fixers, programmers become hackers, and managers become intermediaries in money laundering schemes. The market remains, but its ethics invert. Success is no longer defined by efficiency and legality but by access to coercion and survival within gray zones. This inversion signals a broader transformation of capitalism itself. The post-industrial era, which once appeared as the triumph of knowledge and communication, ends in the proliferation of informal economies and coercive hierarchies. The process mirrors earlier historical transitions. Just as the feudal clergy lost authority with the Reformation and the industrial bourgeoisie declined with automation, the managerial middle class of the post-industrial world is displaced by criminal mediators and technocratic elites. Each stage of civilization thus contains within it the conditions of its own obsolescence. When the structural basis of mediation collapses, sovereignty reorganizes around those who can control circulation whether of goods, violence, or information. The criminal sovereign, in this sense, is not an aberration but the logical successor to the bureaucratic manager. Both ensure the flow of value in conditions of uncertainty, but by different means. At the theoretical level, this transformation demands a redefinition of sovereignty itself. The modern concept of sovereignty, rooted in the state's monopoly on legitimate violence, presupposed a clear division between legality and illegality, public and private, order and disorder. In the post-industrial collapse, these distinctions blur. Power operates through networks rather than hierarchies, and legitimacy derives from functionality rather than law. Informal governance, hybrid warfare, and criminal mediation become the new modalities of control. Sovereignty is no longer territorial but relational, it exists wherever coercion and loyalty intersect. In this sense, criminal sovereignty represents the completion of the post-industrial project, the final abstraction of power from production, law, and moral order. It is the rule of pure function over substance. The decline of post-industrial society thus reveals the dialectical unity between material production and symbolic mediation. The service economy could appear autonomous only so long as it rested upon an externalized industrial foundation. Once that foundation is withdrawn or contested, the symbolic order collapses into the material violence it had sublimated. The disappearance of the middle class exposes this dialectic in its starkest form, the loss of mediation between capital and labor, elite and mass, legality and illegality. What remains is a polarized world of technocratic dominion and criminal governance, united by their shared exclusion of democratic participation. The service society, in its decay, reproduces the very conditions of barbarism it once claimed to have overcome. To confront this transformation, it is not sufficient to lament the decline of the middle class or to call for the restoration of industrial production. The issue is structural. The entire global system of division of labor must be reconsidered. A sustainable social order cannot be based on symbolic value extraction detached from material reality. Nor can sovereignty survive when its mediating institutions are hollowed out and replaced by informal coercion. The reconstruction of mediation economic, political, and cultural requires a reinshawing of value in production, locality, and responsibility. Otherwise, the trajectory of post-industrial civilization leads inexorably toward the consolidation of technocratic oligarchy and criminal sovereignty, a synthesis of control and chaos that marks not the end of history but the return of its most primitive forms under digital guise. In the end, the rise and fall of post-industrial society illustrate a paradox at the heart of modernity, that the quest for abstraction, efficiency, and autonomy from material constraints ultimately dissolves the very foundations of order it depends upon. The dream of a pure service economy, liberated from labor and resource dependency, culminates in a system where services are either automated or criminalized, and where mediation itself becomes an object of coercive competition. The social pyramid that once rested on productive labor and civic participation now stands inverted, a narrow elite of technocrats and enforcers ruling over fragmented masses, with criminal intermediaries performing the functions once reserved for law and bureaucracy. This is not merely a dystopian scenario but a structural reality emerging in diverse regions across the world. The historical cycle that began with the industrial division of labor ends with the criminal division of sovereignty, a transformation that challenges not only economic theory but the very meaning of civilization itself. Chapter 3. The modern history of society is inseparable from the transformation of labor. From the factory system of the industrial age to the financial and algorithmic architectures of the present, the division of labor has served as both the economic foundation and the anthropological matrix of civilization. Labor once mediated the relation between humanity and nature, between the individual and society, and between economy and power. Yet as artificial intelligence begins to assume both the executive and managerial functions of production, the division of labor itself becomes alienated from humanity. The logic of capital, once grounded in the exploitation of human work, is now sustained by self-regulating technological systems that operate beyond the reach of labor. In this transformation, capitalism does not vanish but mutates, assuming post-economic and post-human forms. The genealogy of this process begins with industrial capitalism, where the mechanization of production gave rise to a new class structure. In the industrial epoch, social differentiation followed the logic of productive specialization. The bourgeoisie organized capital, the proletariat executed its commands. The middle class, composed of engineers, administrators, and educators, functioned as the mediating tissue of modernity, translating the commands of ownership into the rhythm of technical and bureaucratic organization. The factory was both an economic and metaphysical model, a vast apparatus in which labor, discipline, and order converged. In this phase, value was produced through human energy. Capital could not reproduce itself without living labor. Marx's formula money transformed into commodities and returning as augmented money, M, depended upon the exploitation of the worker, whose labor time generated surplus value. The division of labor increased efficiency but also deepened alienation, reducing the worker to an appendage of the machine. It was this contradiction that drove the historical expectation of socialism, the belief that technological progress would eventually liberate the worker by making human labor redundant. However, the dialectic has turned in an unforeseen direction. In the 21st century, machines have indeed assumed executive functions, but they have also begun to perform management, analysis, and decision-making. Artificial intelligence organizes not only material processes but social and cognitive ones. The division of labor, which once defined the human species as Homo faber, the maker and organizer, has been appropriated by technology itself. Humanity no longer stands as the collective organizer of production, it is increasingly organized by the very systems it has created. This transformation undermines the material basis of capitalism while preserving its form. Wage labor, the central mechanism of capitalist subordination, ceases to be essential. In classical capitalism, the worker was compelled to sell labor power in order to survive, and capital extracted value from the surplus of this labor. When production becomes autonomous, when machines reproduce value through automation and self-optimization, the worker is displaced from the productive process. The economy ceases to depend on human effort, yet the relations of dependence remain. The logic of subordination persists but sheds its economic character. What emerges is a form of post-economic capitalism. Value is no longer tied to labor time but to information flows, data extraction, and algorithmic control. The market remains, but it is no longer the field of free exchange between producers, it becomes the field of predictive modeling, surveillance, and managed consumption. Under the regime of algorithmic governance, people are not workers but users, not producers but data points. The old factory has dissolved into the digital platform. Labor continues, but it is dispersed across life itself, measured in clicks, movements, emotions, and attention spans. This new configuration of capitalism represents the final abstraction of value. In the industrial age, the commodity embodied human labor; in the algorithmic age, value is generated by the informational traces of behavior. Cryptocurrency and digital finance epitomize this stage. They are forms of capital without labor, currencies backed not by productivity but by energy expenditure and code. In such systems, the market becomes a cybernetic entity, an autonomous process of feedback and calculation, indifferent to human meaning. Capital becomes pure algorithm. If capital once enslaved labor through the wage, it now subordinates humanity through infrastructure. Economic dependency gives way to technological dependency. Power is no longer exercised primarily through ownership of means of production but through control of means of coordination. This is the logic of algorithmic sovereignty, a regime in which authority derives from mastery over information architectures and artificial intelligence systems. Subordination persists, but it is no longer a relation between classes, it is a relation between the human and the machinic. The disappearance of wage labor thus poses a new ontological question: what is the place of the human when the division of labor itself becomes autonomous? Marx's theory of alienation must be reinterpreted. In industrial capitalism, the worker was alienated from the product of labor. In the algorithmic regime, humanity is alienated from labor altogether. The very process of organization has been externalized into artificial systems. The human species becomes a spectator to its own productive activity, which now unfolds without its participation. The collective reason of humanity, once projected into machines as a means of liberation, returns as an autonomous intelligence that renders humanity functionally superfluous. The Hegelian dialectic has reached its negative culmination. Spirit, having objectified itself completely in technology, no longer requires the consciousness that gave it birth. What unites these potential futures is the persistence of hierarchy. Even as economic exploitation becomes obsolete, the structures of domination remain. The problem of capitalism, stripped of its economic content, becomes the problem of governance itself, who commands the systems that command the world. The disappearance of wage labor eliminates one form of alienation but introduces another, deeper one: the loss of agency over the processes that define existence. The task that once belonged to the proletariat, the overthrow of economic dependence, returns in a higher form as the struggle against technological dependence. This struggle is complicated by the seductive neutrality of algorithms. Whereas industrial power was visible and coercive, algorithmic power is invisible and participatory. Individuals believe themselves free even as they serve the system through their interactions. Domination is exercised not through repression but through stimulation, not through the restriction of choice but through its preemption. The subject of post-economic capitalism is not the oppressed worker but the obedient user. Capitalism, in this light, does not disappear but transcends its economic stage, becoming a universal form of organization. Its principal control through mediation detaches itself from the factory and the market and migrates into the fabric of digital life. It is possible to speak of a capitalism without capital, an order of subordination maintained by information rather than ownership. The economy dissolves into cybernetics, and the social relation becomes a technical relation. Whether this transformation will culminate in renewed servitude or in a new form of collective autonomy depends on the political use of technology. If artificial intelligence remains under the control of concentrated elites, corporate, state, or algorithmic, it will solidify into a form of post-human feudalism. If it becomes a means of collective organization, it may inaugurate a new synthesis, realizing in technological form what socialism once promised in economic form. The question is whether humanity will remain the sovereign subject of organization or become the object of machinic organization. In the end, the evolution from capital to algorithm reveals that the essence of domination is not economic but structural. The hierarchy between those who organize and those who are organized persists even when labor disappears. The machine inherits both the function of the worker and the authority of the master. The human being, unless it reclaims its power of organization, risks being reduced to a residual presence, a decorative remnant in a self-organizing world. The fate of the division of labor thus becomes the fate of humanity itself. Once the principle of cooperation and progress, it now threatens to dissolve the human role in production, knowledge, and governance. The historical dialectic that began with the subordination of man to machine in the factory ends with the subordination of man to machine in the network.